When Western Europe falls to the Nazi German Reich in the spring of 1940, there is one thing that unites the people in occupied Scandinavia and Benelux. There's a widespread desire there to resist the Nazi occupation. But how do you do that without guns, without an organization, without an army? The answer will come over the radio, and it will come from Great Britain. This is War Against Humanity, a subseries of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus Olsson. In our previous episodes about the resistance, we looked at how in 1940 German resistance was a small but significant part of the overall military and civilian opposition to Nazism. Then we looked at how the occupied French were stuck in a holding pattern, uncertain how to proceed, divided on collaboration or resistance. Now we turn to Scandinavia and the Benelux countries. Much like France, all these countries are sent into a state of shock when the Germans invade and conquer faster than expected. Also, like in France, there is a section of the population that sympathizes with the Nazis and collaborate from day one. But it's important here to remember that both people who actively collaborate or resist are a minority. Claiming some kind of collective stance of active resistance or framing a whole country as collaborationist is simply false, at least now in 1940-41. The vast majority of people across the occupied territories are just trying to cope with a terrible situation. And for the Nazis in 1940-41, it is important to at least get the conquered peoples to accept them with the prospect of eventually joining them. Thus, neither is resistance insignificant or meaningless, nor is collaboration ineffectual. Both camps will play an important part in swaying the population one way or the other. For the Nazis, it is therefore essential to engage with their counterparts in the occupied territories. In Norway, collaboration is organized under Vidkun Quisling, head of the Norwegian Nazi Party, but they're not a very large movement. In Denmark, the Danish Nazi Party is wholly insignificant, but will play a small role in government under occupation. In the Netherlands, the NSB, the National Socialist Movement in the Netherlands, led by Anton Mussert, are at outbreak of war fairly insignificant. Yet Mussert is swift at the helm of a concerted effort to set up organized collaboration, and his movements start to grow. In Belgium, there are both Flemish and Wallonian ethnic nationalist fascist movements with tens of thousands of members and paramilitary structures. Before the war comes, they advocate neutrality, but after the defeat, they quickly turn to active collaboration. These movements are historically anti-German, but also vehemently anti-Semitic, and now they will look to the common hatred of Jews to find reconciliation with the Nazi occupiers. In the small Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, the situation is more complicated. About a third of the country openly sympathizes with Germany, and among them are pro-German movements that have advocated joining Germany already before the war. The Volksdeutsche Bewegung starts collaborating from the first day of invasion, effectively splitting the country in two equal minority parts of opposition and collaboration, and a majority of acceptance. Significantly, Volksdeutsche are overrepresented in the duchy's administration, facilitating the incorporation of Luxembourg into the Reich as part of the Gau-Moselland. Now, Luxembourg's fate is significant for how the Nazis view their prospects in all of these countries. Ideologically, the Nazis see these peoples as brother races or even fellow Germans. In what is either hubris, ideological blindness, or perhaps even foolishness, they believe that they will be able to subjugate these countries and yet eventually win the sympathy of these Germanic peoples. For the people, it means that they fare a far less harsh fate in 1940 and early 1941 than Poland. The Germans also treat them better than they do the French, where they plunder and rob the country from the start. In the Netherlands, the living standards even improve throughout 1940 as the Germans start buying massive amounts of produce to feed their growing army. So the Germans have great hopes that eventually these occupied nations will get in line as client states to Greater Germany in some kind of blissful, utopian racial harmony. But somewhat ironically, for a political movement based on identity politics, the Nazis have underestimated something about Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway, the power of nationalism. You see, They are among the oldest nation-states in Europe and the world. That is to say, a nation that has the quality of a sovereign state based on some kind of idea of ethnic sameness and a clear geographic definition of sovereignty, as opposed to ethnically agnostic statehood based on personal regency or a union of more or less independent states. All of them are monarchies that became nation-states between 1830 and 1905, decades before the large post-World War I swell of nation-statehood. Despite being monarchies, they are also largely forerunners in democracy. In 1913, Norway introduces universal suffrage and becomes one of the first true parliamentary democracies. Denmark follows in 1915, the Netherlands 1917 together with Luxembourg, and while Belgium is slower in developing full democracy, women at least gained partial suffrage in 1919 after World War I. Thus, in the interwar years, instead of fighting for sovereignty, trying to define themselves as nations, and experimenting with democracy like most of Europe, these nations are consolidating into what has been in the making for a century: modern, liberal countries with a solidified national identity. That identity is very much personified by the mostly politically powerless crowned heads of state. And it is around these crowns that opposition to Nazi occupation gathers. When Denmark falls in only days, King Christian X stays to weather out the hard times together with his people. Despite being fairly unpopular before the war, he quickly becomes a symbol of passive, stoic, non-collaboration for the Danish people. In public speeches, he calls for calm and to not resist the German occupation. But in what becomes a subtle signal of refusal to accept the Germans as rulers, he develops a daily routine. Each morning, he has his horse Jubilee saddled, all alone despite that he is over 70 years old. Without a groom, without a guard, he then rides through the city of Copenhagen, greeting the crowds as he passes. The signal is clear. The king will not bow to the Germans. He is still here. He remains the head of state. He will not leave. He is with Denmark and the Danes. The Germans can hardly stop him. After all, he's just taking his horse for a walk. The Danish people fully understand and begin wearing royalist lapel pins as a way of showing national unity. Further north in Norway, Christian's brother, King Håkon VII, becomes a symbol of defiance already during the fighting. As the Germans advance, he leaves Oslo and sets up with the government on the Allied side of the front. He refuses German demands to appoint Vidkun Quisling as prime minister and surrender. Despite that he now has a far-reaching wartime legal power, he will not take any decisions without government support. But the government sides with him and called for total resistance to the Germans. From the moment the Norwegian radio NRK broadcast the decision, the king becomes the rallying point of continued resistance. As Norway falls, nearby Sweden refuses to offer him free passage, and the king, instead, makes a daring escape to England, where he vows to continue resistance from abroad together with the government in exile. There, he is soon joined by Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. Wilhelmina exiles to England already on May 13th, 3 days after the German invasion, and after the Netherlands' fall on May 15. She's instrumental in setting up the Dutch government in exile in London. She is incredibly popular with the Dutch people. The young Belgian King Leopold III is also very popular, in difference to the Belgian political leaders. While he has no political power, he is commander-in-chief of the Belgian armed forces. His popularity gets a serious dent when he capitulates to the Germans on May 27th as the Belgian forces are surrounded, outnumbered, and France is falling. The government flees first to France and eventually arrive in Great Britain on October 1940 by way of neutral Spain. Leopold is put under house arrest by the Germans. After the fall of France, Leopold refuses his government's request to speak up and meet them, to let them return and set up a government under occupation. Instead, Leopold chooses silence. While it is hard to understand the exact personal position of the king, the government in exile uses his silence to redraft the public image of the incarcerated king as a symbol of passive resistance. But how do you redraft a public image in your country that is now out of your reach? A country that is under draconian control of a foreign regime that swiftly seizes control of all public communication channels like radio and newspapers? The answer is you set up your own clandestine communications network. Already during 1940, inside the occupied territories, secret presses pop up like mushrooms in the dark. They print thousands of leaflets, forbidden periodicals and newspapers, with news from the outside world and calls for resistance. The publishers get their information from radio programs outside the occupied territory. In Scandinavia, they can listen to either Swedish radio or the BBC English broadcast. And already in June 1940, under the helm of the BBC, the French, under Charles de Gaulle, set up Radio Londres with the soon iconic opener, Ici Londres, les Français parlent aux Français. The Dutch, under Wilhelmina, set up Radio Orange, where Wilhelmina is often personally on the radio calling to her people to stand fast and stay hopeful.
For me, the conferment of this honor derives its greatest value from the fact that, according to your glowing address, I may interpret it as a spontaneous appreciation of and praise for the bearing of my people under the severe trial of the occupation by a usurper whose system is based on slavery.
In September, the Belgians set up Radio Belgique, broadcasting daily in French and Flemish. The German occupiers prohibit both the prince and listening to these radio stations, but it is impossible to monitor millions of people every moment. The publishers are completely independent of each other and too many for the Germans to flush out. When one gets caught, the next one takes up the relay torch. It's a dangerous business, and many of them will be murdered by the Nazis, and yet the underground presses continue rolling. By the end of 1940, it has created a groundswell of hope that gradually translates into active resistance. In Norway, limited sabotage efforts against the Germans. In Denmark, a continuous trickle of Danish boats delivering Jews and other Nazi non-desirables across the Sund to safety in neutral Sweden. In the Netherlands, first a student strike in 1940, and then a general strike in February 1941. It is the first concerted action against the Dutch Jewish population that sets things off. The Nazis had cordoned off the old Jewish quarter in Amsterdam as a ghetto. After a number of violent individual protests, the Germans arrest 425 random Jewish men and ship them off to concentration camp. On February 25th, the Dutch Communist Party calls for a general strike in protest. Many citizens of Amsterdam, regardless of their political affiliation, join in mass protest against the deportation of Jewish Dutch citizens. The next day, factories in Zaandam, Haarlem, Eemden, Weesp, Boezem, Hilversum, and Utrecht join in. The Germans respond with troops firing on the unarmed crowds, killing 9 people and wounding 24. Despite that the protest is not a success, the violence against non-combative Dutch people rallies public support for active resistance. But all of this is disjointed. They are uncoordinated actions that will never put a real dent in the German occupation. But if you can coordinate this and amplify it. On July 16th, Hugh Dalton, the British Minister of Economic Warfare, is tasked to create the Special Operations Executive to achieve this very goal. Or, as Churchill tells him, to go and set Europe ablaze. Dalton, a highly analytical economist and decorated World War I veteran, will use the organizational principles of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, during the Irish War of Independence as a model for the SOE. It will be a multitude of disconnected operative cells, never managed from a central point, but with coordinated goals sent to multiple cells simultaneously through clandestine communication channels. To do this, Dalton has to get trained specialist agents into the occupied territory, who will then recruit and expand the existing resistance cells into the network. In the late summer of 1940, hundreds of these agents are recruited out of the vast number of exiles now in London. One of them is a French wireless operator named Georges Béguet, and he has a novel idea. Since the BBC has set up these radio stations anyway, why not use them? His proposal is both simple and ingenious. The daily broadcast will start with cryptic personal messages, codes for events that the resistance cells will have been informed of on beforehand. When they hear the message, they are to spring into action to support the event. So after the opening phrase, the radio presenter announces, "Before we start, some personal messages." Then follows a list of innocuous, seemingly incomprehensible phrases like, "There is a fire in the insurance agency," or "Grandma is eating our sweets." Completely randomly generated, there is no code to crack here. And the meaning is only communicated directly to the cells that need to know. And since the message is on public radio, it is almost certain that someone in the cell or connected to the cell will get the message. These messages will not only work to guide the resistance, but they will also serve as a reminder to the people in general that anything is being done. And they will serve as a reassurance, a builder of hope, and a builder of support for the resistance. Now, in the beginning of 1941, Béguet and the rest of the SOE are in high gear preparation to parachute into the occupied territories, start distributing arms, radio sets, and instructions. They will build on a foundation of patriotism that in the Benelux and Scandinavian countries has already created an advantage for resistance over collaboration. Patriotism that, after defeat, has been carried by the symbolic crowned heads of these countries. They will use mass communication principles that in 1941 are only 2 decades old and base their strategy on guerrilla tactics used against the Brits only recently. They will bring new hope after the sudden, shocking, crushing defeat of the summer of 1940. A defeat that in the second half of 1940 gave way to consolidation and reflection, a time to realize that German occupation will be nothing else than oppressive, ruinous, and murderous, a time to reflect on what it meant to be a neighbor, a friend, and a patriot, a time to weigh the personal price of resistance against the human price of passive acceptance and collaboration. Many will decide to do nothing. Some will decide to collaborate, but hundreds of thousands of women and men along the Atlantic and North Sea countries will spring into action starting in 1941 to set Europe ablaze from within, to fight back against the Nazi occupiers. Many of them will be captured, tortured, and killed. But if enough of them are successful, it will hobble the Nazis and save countless lives from extermination. Here's hoping for their success. In the next episode on resistance movements, we will go to Poland. If you want to see the episode about the state of resistance in 1940 in Germany, it's right here, any second now. And think of what Woodrow Wilson once said: "The history of liberty is a history of resistance." Consider joining our resistance movement against forgetting the past, the Time Ghost Army. You can sign up on Patreon or at timeghost.tv. Subscribe and ring that bell.